Hi people, it's Archivist here, and today I'm going to be talking about the greatest weakness of the Xbox Series X, and this is a follow-up topic to my reaction to the Halo Infinite reveal. And my initial reaction that was the gameplay was absolutely fine, no issue, very excited to actually play the game without a shadow of a doubt. However, graphically, I thought the game was underwhelming considering the fact it was supposed to be the showcase for the Xbox Series X. And an interesting fact I learned since that initial reaction is that the game wasn't actually running on an Xbox Series X. According to Free for Free, it was running on a PC that would have had comparable specs. So it should still have been comparable to the Xbox Series X in terms of what we were seeing as an output. I certainly hope they didn't overcook the rig to make it look better than it will really look. That's my concern, is that it won't even look as good as the demo showed us because of that knowledge, but hopefully that's not the case and not the topic of this video. The topic is, why then did this game that is going to be a showcase for the next generation console, that's being developed by a AAA studio and Free for Free, why is this looking like Halo 5? Why is it looking so, not terrible, but mediocre? And a lot of people have come to the realization it's because of the Xbox One and the fact that Microsoft want to release Halo Infinite both onto next generation hardware, but also previous generation hardware. In order for this to work, Halo Infinite must be scalable. So they can of course make it 4K 60, on the Xbox Series X, but the actual fundamentals of the game, the base if you will, cannot be too ambitious, because if it is, then how on earth is it going to run on the Xbox One? And I suppose I don't want to be too aggressive in my criticism for the fact they want to do this, because in some ways it's quite noble. They want to make sure that consumers who perhaps can't afford to immediately go to the Xbox Series X can still play Halo Infinite. And they're doing that by making sure it can run on next-gen hardware, but also previous generation hardware. So there is a noble element to it, although even then there's the commercial aspect of meaning they can sell more copies if it's not only on the new hardware. But then I suppose the commercial detriment if it's not compelling enough to get you onto the next generation hardware, right? So there is that, but I just feel like, as noble as that is, it's 7 years difference now. Is it so unreasonable after 7 years for people to upgrade to the next generation tech? There are some industries, let's say like smartphones, where you get new revisions every single year where the hardware improves, and in that situation it would be very brutal to have it where the next generation of hardware, let's say like the iPhone 12, will have its own set of software that simply cannot run on the previous generation, because it would not be fair to get consumers to basically be keeping up to that extent. But even there, with smartphones, there is a certain point at which software will stop being supported on older devices, and honestly 7 years is a pretty reasonable time to expect that. So the fact that Microsoft are choosing to continue to support 7-year hardware at the expense of newer hardware, I think is going to be a bit of an Achilles heel for them, because it means, let's take for example the SSD, right? Now with an SSD, yes, the loading times are going to be faster, presumably, in the Xbox Series X and the Xbox One, but what it means is they can't build the game around an SSD. They can't do things like have huge open worlds with an intelligent streaming system designed to take advantage of it, because if they did that, the moment it went down to the Xbox One version, you'd be going across the Halo ring and you'd get these massive stalls where it would be loading very slowly off the drive. So they can't actually design the game for the SSD. They merely have to allow it to take those, sort of passive improvements such as loading times. Similar in terms of how they design the scale of the world, because if they make the world too large, that would run fine on Xbox Series X, but then on the Xbox One it would fall apart, so they have to do it there as well. So there are lots of sort of considerations in terms of scope that the Xbox One allocation will actually essentially take away from the new version. In fact, something I heard, and maybe it's not linked to this, but I heard that originally the idea was that you would be able to essentially go around the entire Halo ring in Halo Infinite, and they had to scrap the idea. Now that is, I will say, most likely because that's an overly ambitious goal, but it could equally be because they realised there was no way to make that work on the Xbox One, the original Xbox One. So I think this could be a problem for Microsoft going forward, depending on how long they choose to keep up this attitude of essentially supporting older hardware at the expense of the new, because it means that we're not really going to see truly next generation titles for a long time. And I suppose, look, we do see this from other third-party developers. I mean, let's look back at, let's say, Assassin's Creed, for example, when we had the previous transition. What was it? Assassin's Creed Black Flag didn't look tremendously better than something like Assassin's Creed 3, but then when we moved to Unity, as many bugs as there were, the actual engine transition was quite huge to account for the next generation transition. And I think the same thing happened with Call of Duty, actually, where Call of Duty Ghosts didn't look next gen at all, but then when we moved over to Call of Duty Infinite Warfare, that actually looked really good. So perhaps after a year we'll start to see this, but I think the reason it gets kind of unique with Halo Infinite is because they had an opportunity here to give you a reason to get an Xbox Series X. This is why you go out and buy one, because you need to get an Xbox Series X to play it, maybe outside of PC, and or that the hardware is, the graphics are just so impressive that you want to go out and buy one. But my takeaway from the demonstration is that they just gave me no reason to want one, and I'm really looking for a reason to get one. With this whole lead up to both next generation consoles, as I did last time, I really do not make my mind up until basically a month before they come out. That's my attitude, is I truly like to assess which one gives me the most advantages, which one works for me. I don't tend to go by whatever's happening in this generation, because last generation 360 was, in my opinion, vastly superior to how the Xbox One turned out. So I'm willing to continually consider things, but basically going into the Halo Infinite reveal, I was thinking to myself, if this is good, if this is really going to impress me, I'm going to go and get an Xbox Series X, almost certainly. But this has now thrown me more towards the PS5 side because, well, we all know the advantages of Sony. It's usually the first-party exclusives. But the fact that I fear Microsoft are maybe being too consumer friendly for their own good in this regard, that they are trying to support something so old at the expense of the new, is going to be a continuing issue for them. And I think this is what it comes down to. It's just not exciting, right? It's just not exciting to see a next gen game and look at it and think, well, yeah, that could run on what I've got now, like literally, to the left of me. I could just play that now, just maybe a slightly lower resolution. That's not that exciting. And given how long we wait for these consoles to come out, you do want to be, you want it to be compelling, essentially. So yeah, look, it's Microsoft's decision ultimately. Perhaps their view of where Xbox is going is that it isn't going to be these massive leaps. It's just going to be this small, continual progression. And there are absolutely advantages to that, especially from a software point of view, because this does mean, again, that they'll probably sell more copies of Halo Infinite, because they don't just have people buying the Xbox Series X who can buy it. It'll also be their existing install base on the Xbox, so there are advantages to it. But I think in terms of the excitement generated around the next-gen console, they originally got me with the sheer power that was going to be on display here, but they've lost me now with the fact that I think they're going to basically, what's the best way to say it? They have the potential, but I don't know that they're going to realise it, right? They've got all this hardware power to craft the most immersive, most compelling games we have ever seen, and they seem to be choosing not to. And I hope that maybe that design philosophy shifts. I mean, just look at how much their philosophy changed in this generation with the initial release of the Xbox One. It was very much focused as a media center. In fact, the name Xbox One derives from the fact it's your all-in-one entertainment system. But gradually over time, I think it's transitioned into a far better, more truly game-focused experience, especially with the release of the fantastic Xbox One X, which I really enjoy. So there's no reason to believe that they won't do something similar here, where they'll transition their philosophy from this slow increments to truly realizing the power that they have to play with. But yeah, that's my concern, is that the base Xbox One is basically the reason that Halo Infinite looks like this, even when they're trying to show it on the Xbox Series X. If anyone's got any opinion on it, it'd be really interesting to hear what you think. I would imagine this is going to have a mixed response. I know there's plenty of people who don't want to upgrade immediately but want to play Halo Infinite, so I would imagine in that situation you're not too concerned, but maybe there are people like me who are basically wanting Microsoft to sell them, if you will, like really sell them on the Xbox Series X, but feel perhaps that they haven't done that, at least at this standpoint. Maybe just to throw in some positives here at the final point, I guess there's the fact that they've mentioned recently that the multiplayer will be 120 frames per second, which is pretty cool. I don't think I've ever heard of that in console gaming before, so I'm pretty excited about that. Assuming, of course, that in order to get it to 120 frames per second, it doesn't look absolutely terrible. Like, it's basically just Lego characters walking around. They've had to reduce the graphics so much, so long as it hasn't done that. But yeah, regardless. Let me know what you're thinking in the comments below. As always, people, thanks very much for watching, and see you next time.